I often wonder how I ended up here, sitting on the edge of a beige sofa, staring at the muted glow of the city lights outside my apartment window, while the man I loved, Mark, was in the kitchen, humming softly as he washed the dishes. It wasn't that he wasn't kind, he was steady, reliable, the kind of partner who remembered birthdays and never raised his voice. Yet, despite all that, I felt an emptiness I couldn't name. A quiet ache, like a space in my chest that had grown too large to fill with ordinary affection. Mark and I had been together for almost 4 years. On paper, we had it all: 2 bedrooms, a small balcony where we sometimes drank coffee in the mornings, and weekends that passed predictably, filled with errands and occasional dinners with friends. But predictability has a way of dulling the senses. I loved him, in a sense. But it was a calm, placid love, the kind that doesn't stir the blood or quicken the heart. It was comfortable, yes, but I felt more like a roommate than a partner most days. I tried to convince myself that this was enough, that wanting more was selfish, that longing for something undefined was a mistake. Yet, every time I returned from work or passed other couples walking hand in hand in the street below, I felt a pang of yearning, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind suggesting that maybe, just maybe, life could feel different. Brighter, sharper, more alive. It was in those quiet moments, alone in the apartment, that I first noticed him, Daniel, my new neighbor. I had seen him a few times, always arriving home late, carrying a single duffel bag, and disappearing behind the door of apartment 3B. He didn't make noise. He didn't linger in the hallways with small talk. He simply existed, quietly, as though he had no need to announce himself to the world. There was something almost magnetic about his silence, the way he seemed to observe without judgment, to move through life without unnecessary attention. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. That a passing glance in the hallway or a brief nod in the elevator wasn't enough to stir my attention. But over the following weeks, I found myself noticing him more and more. The way he'd pause at the mailbox, carefully sorting letters, the slight crease of concentration when he unlocked his door, the way he would sometimes linger near the stairwell, as if taking in the quiet hum of the building around him. I began to anticipate these small moments, as though they were fragments of a story I hadn't yet learned to read. It was strange, the way my thoughts would drift toward him without reason. I didn't know him. I hadn't spoken a single word beyond polite greetings, yet I felt a pull I couldn't quite name. I hated myself a little for it, even as I felt it growing. My life with Mark was safe, predictable, and yet increasingly suffocating. And here was Daniel, silent, distant, unknowable, offering something I couldn't define but desperately wanted. I tried to push the feelings away, focusing on mundane routines, on folding laundry and checking emails, on anything that could tether me back to normalcy. But the quiet presence of the neighbor lingered, a shadow at the edges of my mind, a question I didn't dare to answer: what would it feel like to connect with someone in a way that felt entirely right? That night, as the city lights blinked softly against the darkness, I leaned back against the sofa and closed my eyes, listening to the faint hum of Mark's humming in the kitchen. I felt the weight of my own longing pressing down, heavy and persistent. And I realized, with a mixture of guilt and undeniable curiosity, that life was asking me to notice something I had never allowed myself to see before, and perhaps, to feel something I wasn't sure I deserved. And so, in the quiet of my apartment, I waited, unknowingly, for a story to begin that would shift everything I thought I knew about love, desire, and the boundaries we choose to respect. It started with a knock on my door one evening, soft and hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, holding a small package that I hadn't expected. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice low, measured, almost careful, as if each word had to be chosen. "I think this was delivered to my apartment by mistake. Thought you might want it back." I took the package, fumbling slightly, noticing the subtle way his fingers lingered on the edge of mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Thanks," I muttered, a little breathless, aware of how ordinary the moment felt and yet how intensely alive it seemed. He nodded, stepping back just enough to give the space etiquette demanded, but not so much that the connection between us frayed. From that night on, our encounters grew more frequent, though never planned. A glance in the hallway became a conversation, a shared elevator ride stretched into minutes of quiet talk about trivial things, work schedules, the weather, the endless hum of the city outside. It was nothing dangerous, nothing physical, and yet there was a weight to it, a resonance I hadn't realized I was missing in my life with Mark. Daniel listened differently, not with the distracted nods of polite attention, but with a kind of patience that made every word I said feel significant. He asked questions, followed up on small details I didn't even remember sharing. In his presence, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. There was a calm sincerity in his silence between words, a stillness that contrasted sharply with the constant noise of my own restless thoughts. It wasn't that I wanted Mark less, I still cared for him, appreciated his stability, the way he tried to make life smooth and predictable. But Daniel stirred something more fragile, more intimate, a recognition of my own desires that I had been too cautious, too polite to acknowledge. I found myself thinking about him during the day, recalling the tilt of his head, the quiet attentiveness in his gaze, and feeling a mixture of excitement and guilt I couldn't fully untangle. One night, while carrying groceries from the lobby to my apartment, I ran into him again. He was leaning casually against the stairwell railing, arms crossed, the faintest crease of amusement on his face. "You're making that look heavier than it is," he teased gently. And in that moment, the simplicity of our interaction made my chest tighten. It was absurd, really, a comment about a bag of apples, but the warmth of attention, of shared humor, felt like a lifeline. I laughed, trying to mask the sudden flutter of nerves. "Maybe," I said, "but at least it's healthy." Daniel's eyes lingered on me a beat longer than necessary, and I felt it, a subtle acknowledgement that this connection, small as it seemed, was something mutual, something neither of us had expected. As the days passed, the quiet exchanges became the highlight of my otherwise predictable routine. I found myself timing errands to coincide with his hallway walks, lingering slightly longer in the elevator than I needed, just to speak a few more words. Each conversation left me lighter, more aware of myself, and yet simultaneously guilty. I would return to Mark in the evenings, folding laundry or sipping tea, and a part of me would ache for the attentiveness Daniel offered so freely. And yet, even in these early days, a line remained intact. Nothing had happened beyond words, smiles, small gestures, and the occasional shared laugh. It was the kind of closeness that made your heart race without threatening the physical boundaries that defined my life. But the intensity of the connection, quiet as it was, left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, about desire, and about what it meant to truly be understood. That week ended with a lingering moment in the hallway, the building nearly silent, lights dimmed. Daniel and I stood close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence, yet far enough to honor the unspoken rules we had never articulated. I wanted to say more, to linger indefinitely, but the sound of my own heartbeat reminded me that desire, unacknowledged, could be dangerous in its silence. And so I walked to my apartment, package in hand, feeling both exhilarated and conflicted. Something had shifted, imperceptibly yet irreversibly. The quiet neighbor was no longer just a face in passing, he had become a presence I couldn't ignore, a mirror reflecting desires I hadn't dared to name, and I realized, with a mixture of fear and anticipation, that my life was about to become far more complicated than I had ever imagined. The connection with Daniel had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it in every fiber of myself. It was no longer just the occasional hallway conversation or shared laugh, it had become an undercurrent that tugged at me throughout the day. I found my mind drifting to him in moments I should have been fully present with Mark, while cooking dinner, during dull meetings at work, even when Mark asked me a simple question about the groceries. The guilt of noticing, of wanting, weighed on me, but the thrill of it made my heart beat faster. I started seeking excuses to see Daniel more often. A misplaced mail package, a minor question about the building, even a fabricated complaint about a flickering hallway light, all trivial reasons that allowed us to talk. He didn't question them. He simply listened, his calm, attentive presence grounding me in a way that Mark never had. With Daniel, I could speak freely, without pretense, without the careful filters I used with Mark to maintain harmony. And each time I left those brief encounters, I felt lighter, yet simultaneously riddled with a gnawing guilt I couldn't shake. It was during one of those late-night encounters in the stairwell that I first realized how dangerous this was becoming. Daniel leaned against the railing, arms casually folded, and I found myself staring at him longer than I intended. His gaze caught mine, and I felt it, not a physical spark, not yet, but something that made my chest tighten. He said nothing, just tilted his head slightly, a question lingering unspoken in his expression. And for a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to let myself cross the line, to close the distance between us entirely. But I didn't. I stepped back, forcing a casual smile, pretending that my heartbeat wasn't betraying me. I should get going, I said, though neither of us moved. His eyes held mine a fraction longer, silent acknowledgement of the tension between us, and then he nodded, stepping aside as I walked past him. My legs shook slightly, and I cursed myself for letting it feel so real. After that night, the encounters became more emotionally intimate. I texted him under the pretense of sharing a note about building maintenance or a question about a package, but the messages stretched longer, filled with personal reflections I had never shared with Mark. Daniel responded with thoughtfulness, humor, and an empathy that seemed effortless. And in each exchange, I felt the thrill of being understood, of being seen in ways I hadn't realized I craved. Mark remained unaware, of course. I carried the duality silently, pretending normalcy while my thoughts lingered elsewhere. I even found myself lying by omission, a skill I had never mastered before. I stayed late at work, I would say, when in reality I had lingered in the lobby, hoping to catch a glimpse of Daniel. Traffic was terrible, I claimed, when my detour was toward a building I didn't need to visit. Each small lie was a tiny fracture in my conscience, but I told myself it was harmless, that nothing physical had happened, that it was only words, only glances, only unspoken tension. And yet, the danger lay precisely in that emotional closeness. Daniel became a mirror of my desires, reflecting my longing for connection, attention, and understanding. The rational part of me whispered warnings, reminding me that boundaries existed for a reason. But the emotional part, the part that had grown restless in the calm waters of my relationship with Mark, pushed back, whispering that perhaps this feeling, this closeness, was exactly what I had been missing all along. One night, as I stood outside Daniel's apartment delivering a package he had forgotten, I lingered a heartbeat too long. He caught my gaze, his expression unreadable, and I felt the tension coiling between us like a live wire. Nothing happened. No words crossed the line, no physical touch occurred beyond the package exchange. Yet, as I walked back to my apartment, I realized the line had already begun to blur, and my mind was no longer capable of separating friendship from something far more potent. I returned to Mark that evening, sipping tea at the kitchen table, pretending everything was ordinary. And in the quiet that followed, I understood with sudden clarity, emotional infidelity had begun. I hadn't kissed him, hadn't held him, but I had allowed my heart to wander, to recognize a connection that felt undeniably right. The choice, I realized, was approaching, not yet made, but inevitable. And in that knowledge, I felt the paradox of exhilaration and dread, the way one always feels when the rules of one's own heart begin to shift under the weight of desire. The tension I had carried for weeks finally became unbearable one quiet evening. Mark was in the living room, absorbed in his book, and I sat on the edge of the sofa, feeling the weight of the choices I had been evading. Every message from Daniel lingered in my mind, every brief encounter in the hallway replayed like a private film. I knew I could no longer pretend that it was harmless, that the emotional closeness I had cultivated was separate from my life with Mark. The line had already blurred, and ignoring it had become impossible. I didn't know exactly when the shift had occurred. Perhaps it was the way Daniel's gaze followed me when I spoke, the subtle warmth in his attention, or the effortless understanding that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't physical desire alone, it was recognition, empathy, and the realization that my heart could respond so fully outside of the life I had painstakingly built with Mark. And now, faced with the stark contrast between comfort and connection, I was forced to confront a truth I had been postponing. I had to choose. I called Daniel that night, my hands trembling slightly, the apartment silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. His voice on the line was soft, patient, waiting, as if he had anticipated my call. I told him nothing at first, fumbling through words about a package I had forgotten, a late-night thought I wanted to share. But then, finally, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest: do you ever feel like you understand someone in a way that just shouldn't happen? There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost feel him weighing his response. Sometimes, he said finally, it's like noticing something you didn't realize was missing. The words struck me like a match in darkness, illuminating everything I had been avoiding. I realized then that we were no longer just neighbors or casual companions, we had become mirrors of each other's desires, and there was no returning to innocence. The next morning, I woke with a strange clarity, the kind that comes only when a decision has been made before words are spoken. Mark was still asleep when I quietly made my way to the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I couldn't continue this duality, couldn't love two people in such fundamentally different ways without fracturing myself completely. It was unfair, to Mark, to Daniel, and, most of all, to me. When Mark woke, I sat him down in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. My words were careful, chosen, as always, but now with honesty cutting through the hesitation. I spoke about my feelings, my emotional distance, the connection I had found elsewhere. I didn't mention Daniel explicitly at first. I spoke of longing, of wanting more than comfort, of needing something I hadn't realized I was missing. Mark listened quietly, his expression unreadable, and for the first time in months, I saw him not as a background fixture of my life, but as someone with his own presence, capable of feeling hurt, betrayed, disappointed. It was painful. It was necessary. The conversation ended with tears, a quiet goodbye to the version of our life that had once felt so secure. And in that moment of honesty, I felt a mixture of grief and liberation, the way one feels when a door closes behind them and another, unfamiliar, opens. Later, I found myself walking past Daniel's apartment. He was there, leaning lightly against the railing, the evening lights casting soft shadows across his face. I didn't rush in. I didn't pretend. I simply stood for a moment, allowing the weight of everything that had happened to settle. We shared a look, brief and unspoken, heavy with acknowledgement. No words were necessary, the choice had been made, boundaries respected, consequences accepted. I walked back to my apartment alone, yet not empty. There was a strange serenity in knowing I had acted with integrity, in facing the truth of my emotions, and in allowing the inevitability of change to guide me. The connection with Daniel remained, undeniable and lingering, but it was no longer a secret that haunted me. It was a part of my story, a reflection of what I had needed to see about myself. And in the quiet aftermath, as the city hummed outside my window, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the right connection arrives at the wrong time, and life asks us to choose, between comfort and truth, between what we are accustomed to and what we need to become. I had chosen, and though the path ahead was uncertain, I was ready to walk it, one honest step at a time.